That was amazing. You're not a faculty member. You have a beautiful PowerPoint. You stayed under time. Maybe you're onto something. All right. All right, group 2, handling ethics in the classroom.
That shouldn't be a problem, she says. Okay. Hi. So I'm Stephanie Bird. Our group 2 was called Handling Ethics in the Classroom. So some of the other questions, some of the other areas here didn't really reflect on us. The questions that we were dealing with, the first question was, and it's my understanding the questions came from the teams, so my expectation is that if there were other answers to these questions that the teams had in mind, that would be good, because we didn't actually have some of these experiences to deal with. But we'll get to that. So the first question was, what are the drawbacks to treating ethics as a matter of personal responsibility? And we were a little bit confused by that because we weren't exactly clear whether it was how that related to the professional responsibilities of engineers. And ultimately, we came to an assessment that, or the view that what we were talking about is as an individual representative of the profession of engineering. So if someone had a different idea when they were asking that question. But we certainly talked about the challenges of individual responsibilities and separating those from professional responsibilities, and in particular as being a representative of a particular group, whatever that group might be. So as individuals, we wear a lot of hats, including the hat, if you're an engineer, of engineering, for example. And people will, how one behaves in public will be taken as a sign of how you behave in or as a representative of that whole field of a group of engineers. And that people who are in engineering will be perceived in a certain way by the larger society, and engineering itself will be perceived in a way by society, based upon how you perform to the extent that you're known to be an engineer, for example. And so that we thought that had implications for how one is seen in public, for example, behaving properly or improperly, and how that's perceived. And to the extent that you want your students to understand that who they associate with and how they associate and how they interact publicly is a reflection on them and on the profession of engineering. So we wanted to point out to the students that, and it was brought up, for example, that when you're on Facebook and you have photographs of you in Facebook in a social setting, that those photographs can, for example, be the students should understand that this can have long-term implications in terms of how they're perceived as professionals or not professionals, even though they see themselves as, at that particular moment in time, they're in a social setting. So we thought it was important for the students to understand that they were acting within a larger context that may not be obvious to them, and it was important to convey that information to them and to how they would be perceived. We also thought that, so the second question was, how do you demonstrate that everyday decisions interact with broader social dynamics? And so in that sense, we wanted them to understand that they needed to, for example, cell phones are so common and they're such a way of setting people apart instead of connecting them. They connect them over distances, but that means that they put up barriers for people when you're right there at the same place at the same time, in a meeting or in a classroom or even in a social setting where people whip out their cell phones and don't talk to the people that are across the table from them. So we thought that promising strategies for dealing with these things in the classroom were to remind faculty and students about what the boundaries are within a classroom setting. So, for example, we thought that one thing that was really important to highlight was respect for participants in the classroom and for, as well, not only the other students, but also the faculty member, and important to have space for communicating and communicating respect, that is exchanges of ideas, and to make sure that as the instructor or the professor in the class, in handling those kinds of discussions, that respect and not allowing people to interrupt each other and allowing people to fully express their views, and at the same time maintain a level of civility was essential for the classroom setting. And we talked about the need to promote participation in the classroom as a practice for promoting participation in discussions in a professional setting, and therefore we talked about the need to make sure there was space for communicating and to make explicit, for example, what are a lot of times, most times in classrooms, participation is one of the things that students are evaluated on for grades, and so to make explicit what it is that that kind of participation looks like in terms of listening as well as speaking up and responding in a timely way. Another question that we were to address was, what are good strategies for handling students' emotions that may emerge when discussing controversial topics? And none of us really had a lot of experience with that in terms of that arising in the classroom. That is, aside from the idea of making sure that people are listening and interacting responsively, there was no situation in which people found themselves having to deal with emotions to a great degree, except in one particular instance where there were two opposing views, and it was whether or not to have implants, and it was among cochlear implants among deaf students, and they fell into it's important to have them, or to have that as an option, and it's important not to do it. And so there was no obvious way to resolve that problem. But there might be particular examples that the team had in mind, whoever it was that raised this question. So those were the issues that we talked about. That is the importance of maintaining respect and interactions, and the potential for conflicts of interest when one is assigned to a particular community and is wearing different hats at the same time. Other things to add?
Questions or comments? Handling ethics in the classroom. Stephen? Sorry, we're going to ask you to stand up and use the microphone.
This refers to your comments about behaving in public and being perceived. I was curious about what sorts of behaviors that were being evaluated, and who were considered the ones who were perceiving, and what was considered as professional or unprofessional. And my concern is around creating standards for normative behavior and of people who do engineering, and maybe excluding certain people whose behavior didn't seem to be normative. So could you address that a little more fully?
So and I think the take-home message that we had was that it's complicated, and that it's not always obvious. And so what seems perfectly appropriate, going out with friends and having a drink, is one thing. If you're going out and getting rowdy and drunk and DUIs, et cetera, that's another problem. Now, who perceives what? Obviously, it's how one's presenting themselves in a larger community. And that means that there needs to be it's an iterative process, both personally in terms of personal reflection, but also in terms of the community. So, for example, it seems entirely appropriate to go out if your students want to have a beer on Friday night and have a discussion about mentoring kinds of issues. But if everybody goes home drunk, then that's a problem. So it's really a complicated issue. And that's what we wanted to make clear, is that it's not always simple.
Yeah, I wonder if you have any experience or data on trigger warnings within ethics engineering, because that has increased in the humanities at the very least. And secondly, this is anecdotal, but I have noticed an increase in students who are declaring that they're on some sort of medicine to deal with depression and so on and so forth. Over 20 years, it has significantly increased. Yeah.
Let me just be clear about your second point, in terms of whether students announce to...
They have to have a medical, I don't know
dispensation.
what it's called. Dispensation, thank you.
Okay. Right.
Yes.
Because they're taking a particular medication?
Yeah, sort of, if you have some sort of disability and you require more time, students now also report more frequently that they are on some sort of med.
That they're on some medication and therefore they should...
Yes, yes, yeah.
Any kind of accommodation?
Yes.
Okay. We didn't talk about that, so that would probably be a good... we didn't talk about trigger warnings at all. That's certainly, and to what extent that's something that needs to be discussed in class. That's certainly a good academic kind of topic in academic settings.
I teach sociology of gender, and so there's a lot of issues around sexual assault and violence, et cetera. So this is something that substantively I have to deal with a lot. And what I've come to do is, rather than offer blanket trigger warnings, have each student fill out a index card at the beginning. It's also an opportunity to get people's preferred pronouns, et cetera, which is really important. But also say if there are things that they would like particular heads up about that would make them uncomfortable to read about or hear about in lecture, that they would like notification beforehand, I would be happy to do that. But that takes the burden off me of having to predict what those are and actually have concrete things to do.
So basically having the students inform you and making clear at the beginning of the class that they need to let you know if there are particular issues that concern them.
Yes.
And then that provides you with the opportunity to both be aware of it and to respond either online, in class, or out of class.
Yes.
Appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Sounds like a good plan to me.